Scott Cummings, a 36-year-old executive chef from Woodstock, Illinois, would compete on the 12th season of Hell's Kitchen, one of the most iconic seasons in the show's history, and Scott's insane underdog run is a huge reason for that. Today, we'll be going through his entire run in Hell's Kitchen, from every important confessional and moment, to see just how the ultimate underdog pulled off the unthinkable, and somehow, someway, won this season. Be sure to hit that subscribe and like button for more story videos like this, and with that, here is the wild story of Scott Cummings.
Bloody hell, here I go again.
Season 12 would begin with 20 chefs, and similar to Janelle the previous season, this on paper means Scott will have the toughest road to victory compared to any other HK winners due to the increased competition. On a side note, it is pretty funny that due to the Janelle situation, the reward for the season will be the same as last season, as that was announced to the audience, but the chefs here were simply told that they are competing for a Gordon Ramsay restaurant. But speaking of, the competition will begin as usual with the signature dish challenge, and right away, Scott had a chance to not only impress Ramsay with his dish and make a good first impression, but win the challenge for the blue team. However,
you have the most
once again, due to that being the only mistake that was shown for Scott, he would avoid nomination, even though actually 3 chefs would get nominated this time after yet another awful service. But yeah, 3 episodes in, and while Scott isn't looking nearly as bad as some of the other chefs during the infamous 3 service start to season 12, it's hard to say he's standing out. Episodes 4 to 6 would be pretty invisible for Scott, which while not great that he's not standing out compared to the likes of Joy and Anton, at least he's not being shown to mess up, especially since in episodes 4 and 5, the blue team would continue to lose, but he would avoid nomination, and then they would finally earn their first service win in episode 6. But again, Scott has not been highlighted in a good way whatsoever during service, which to me is a bad sign, especially when again, the show went out of their way to highlight chefs like Anton, Joy, Rochelle, and Jason, as to me, this would be such an easy way to make them stand out, especially with how much of a train wreck the services have been thus far. And while Scott's story and true underdog run would begin the following episode, again, there's a reason why it's considered an underdog run, as his episode wouldn't be great. But speaking of, episode 7 would begin with the chefs making pizzas for the legendary Wolfgang Puck, with this challenge going down as one of the more infamous bad challenges in Hell's Kitchen history. And unfortunately, Scott was a part of that again, with him and Gabriel only getting a 5. And then during service, Scott's pizza nightmares would continue. After service, there is no avoiding nomination this time for Scott, but luckily, due to Chris being just a bit worse than him during service and throughout the season, he would be booted over Scott, saving Scott from being a forgotten 7th boot. The following episode would be a bit of a mix for Scott, as a big negative was that he didn't get much content about bouncing back or any personal content in general after almost going home. However, during service, he'd be mostly fine, with his only problem being a bit of miscommunication. However, while this would never happen, I'm sure, had the blue team somehow lost that service, I genuinely think Scott could have been the one to go home, as the only other chef to make a mistake that night was Jason, who granted had a dreadful night, serving up multiple plates of raw chicken. But still, I imagine had those two been the nominees, Scott would have been the one to go home. Again, would likely never happen, but just goes to show where Scott is on the totem pole for the blue team. And speaking of, we would see how the blue team felt about Scott during episode 9. The episode will once again start with Scott having the game losing dish during the challenge, this time losing to Sandra of all people. However, this literally might have been a life-changing loss for Scott, as the blue team would see just how weak and cranky 48-year-old Rich could get. So as I said earlier, the blue team would evaluate their members by picking the weakest link, and due to likely more so his age and weight as opposed to actual cooking skills, Richard would be chosen over Scott. But again, it was really close, as we know Anton and Ralph voted for Scott, while Jason and Scott voted for Rich, which means that Rich likely voted for someone else, meaning that Gabriel saved Scott's butt by voting for Rich over Scott, as this would of course be the first ever Cook for Your Life elimination challenge, as Richard and Jessica would duel it off with 3 life or death dishes. But again, not only does Scott barely escape this challenge to begin with, but I think this pretty much confirms that cooking wise, the blue team feels Scott is the weakest, as again, Richard was only chosen due to his physical weakness, not his cooking. And who knows, maybe Scott would have beaten Jessica like Richard did regardless, but yeah, people often forget how lucky Scott got here. But again, Old Man Rich would do just a bit better than Jessica, taking us in episode 10, a very interesting episode for Scott's story. The episode would essentially be an entire service, and it would not be a good one whatsoever for the blue team, with Scott once again being in the middle of a service where the blue team got kicked out.
Garnish for the
Again, I'll always stick by this, but I do think that Gabriel nominating Ralph instead of sticking to the nominees of himself and Scott saved Scott's life in Hell's Kitchen. Because again, Scott hadn't been anything but perfect thus far, and while you could say the same thing for Ralph, Ramsay usually doesn't go away from the nominations unless the situation truly calls for it, and I don't think Ralph's service or overall performance warranted an elimination without nomination in this case. However, with Gabriel nominating him, that made it much easier for Ramsay to eliminate Ralph. So yeah, that's 2 straight episodes where you could argue Gabriel saved Scott, and even though it's been a bumpy ride thus far, Scott is halfway through the competition. But again, it's hard to argue with anyone who has him as one of the next couple of boots, as surely at some point, his luck will run out. But as if right on cue, you could argue that episode 11 would be the official start of Scott's comeback story, as this risk taken would pay off, as he would finally win the challenge deciding dish for the blue team. And then during service, while it would not be a great service for Scott, it would be an even worse one for Anton, with the latter blaming Scott for all his problems.
Put the salmon down.
I think I might have seen it all.
Scott would end up getting put up with Anton for elimination, but in the end, nobody would go home, as Anton and Scott would join the red team, while Rochelle and Sandra would join the blue, and thus, this is officially a new beginning for Scott at the halfway point of the season. But in even bigger news, Scott for the first time all season is now in a favorable view of the audience, as even though he wasn't hated by any means before this episode, between his risk taken finally paying off, and being at the brunt of Anton's rage, it's hard not to want to root for Scott now going forward, even though he may not exactly be a frontrunner. So despite this being a new start for Scott, he's still stuck with his rival, and 3 women who are not pleased to have men on their team. Seriously, poor Scott cannot catch a break. However, Scott would impress the red team right away, producing a great dish in the King of the Hill challenge, and would even get a chance to sit in the chair, but Rochelle would be the one to win it single-handedly for the blue team. And then there in service, it would be the ever so important charity night, the first chance for Scott to show off his leadership skills to Ramsay. And safe to say, this would be the first sign of Scott's incredible leadership, something he would become known for.
Scott.
Obviously, Scott was never going home over to the other 3, with Sandra being the one to leave in the end. But man, even a really solid all-around episode for Scott, it still feels like he's in a hole, with the red team ladies not even hiding their dislike for the blue team members joining them. The final 9 episode would be a much needed cooldown episode for Scott though, as this time, the red team got along well enough, to the point where they would forever break the blue versus red team menu challenge, picking dishes they had success with in the past as opposed to trying to make the perfect 5-star dish. And they would have a very good service, with Scott being shown to make no mistakes whatsoever, winning service, but also losing Melanie in the process to the blue team. Ironically, the red team member who was least against Scott and Anton. It's the final 8 now, and Scott is hanging on by a thread, but he has another chance to impress Ramsay with the ever so important blind taste test, as he would do well enough, getting 2 out of 4, but more importantly, Jason would score a 0, something to keep in mind going forward. But during service, Scott would suffer the consequences of the team that didn't like him, as even though he got the kitchen off to a great start on apps, being the great guy he was, instead of letting the others fail, he tried to help them, only to get blamed for making things worse. Despite Anton and Keisha clearly having the worst nights, Joy protected her girl Keisha, putting the guys up for elimination. And despite on paper Anton having a better resume to survive, you just could not overlook yet another dreadful service where he literally blamed the oven and talked back to sous chef Andy, and thus, Scott would nearly survive once again. So as has been the case since seemingly the final 14 or so, Scott is in massive danger of going home at any time, especially since he's pretty much guaranteed to go for elimination on the red team. But luckily, he would get a massive chance to save himself, as the final 7 would cook for immunity, which in turn would get them into the final 6, which of course means earning a black jacket. And while Ramsay praised Scott to the returning chefs, his risk wouldn't deliver this time, earning only a total of 11 points, with Joy being the one to win the challenge. And then to make things worse, Scott would have, without question, his worst service of the season.
It's got good.
Luckily for Scott though, Gabriel would have an even worse service, and due to his automatic elimination, Scott would completely fall into a black jacket. Not only is this one of the luckiest breaks for a winner ever, but this was arguably the third time Gabriel saved Scott from elimination this season, although obviously this time it was completely unintentional. But hey, while it was not pretty whatsoever, Scott's in the Black Jacket Club, and the individual portion of the competition is officially underway. And while it's a long shot, if Scott can sneak his way to the Final Four, it'll be interesting to see if his strong leadership skills we saw earlier on can propel him to victory. The first Black Jacket episode would get off to a good start for Scott, and would be some interesting foreshadowing, as the two guys outdid the four girls, literally tying scores, and thus both Jason and Scott would enjoy reward. Service though would be an interesting one once again for Scott, as after a decent start on apps, he would once again be too much of a nice guy, you could say, as he went over to help the sinking Keisha on Fish. This led him to make his own mistake though, and made the massive mistake of talking back to Ramsay.
What happened there?
Again, I know this wasn't much of a true backtalk that resulted in an automatic elimination, for instance, but still, this is most certainly unexpected from Scott, and yet another up and down service for him. Luckily, as mentioned, Keisha had a complete meltdown this service, and while on paper you could argue she deserved another chance over Scott, unlike say the final 10 or 11 rounds, Ramsay simply can't play like that anymore, and eliminated the clearly unready Keisha over Scott. So I know I've been saying Scott is on thin ice for a while now, but there was always something who had been as inconsistent as him, or had massive falls like Anton and Keisha that allowed him to survive. In this final 5 round though, he's the clear outsider, as Melanie, Rochelle, Joy, and Jason have been incredible all season, with only 3 nominations between the 4, with 2 of those nominations being Rochelle's, which were complete bullcrap. Heck, Scott could have a perfect night and still go home by default. He would need a miracle to survive, and luckily, that miracle would happen in the most shocking of ways.
I'm done.
I like it. Oh, it's good.
After seeming like a dead duck just an episode ago, Scott's incredible leadership run here would land him a spot in the finale, the first person to earn it in fact. The other chef to join him would be Jason, and thus, it would be the ultimate underdog versus the ultimate feel-good story, as Jason of course was lucky to get a second chance in the first place, after being medevaced before the first service in season 9. The finale will begin with the annual finale dish performance for the guest judges, with Scott beating Jason 43-42, giving him the first overall pick. Scott's team in the end would consist of Rochelle, Jessica, Keisha, Ralph, and Chris, with the latter two interestingly being his first 2 picks despite being relatively early boots, showing that Scott was picking people he trusted the most compared to how good they were in the kitchen. So it all comes down to this: Scott, the man who could have been the boot many times throughout the season, and indeed got several lucky breaks, is now all of a sudden the favorite to win after his incredible Final Four leadership pass run. Again, if he could just simply match what he did, he should be a lock to win, but as expected at this point, Scott did more than he needed to in his final HK performance.
Let's go.
Just simply an incredible run from Scott this season. Again, it's not incredible in the fact that he dominates as a chef, but due to all the adversity he had to go through, and still never backing down from the challenge. He was a part of the trainwreck start to the season, and you could even argue he was seen as weaker than the likes of Gabriel and Ralph in the mid-game, much less competing with the big dogs of the season. He did get many lucky breaks, such as Gabriel saving him at the final 12 and 11 respectively, Anton having the biggest downfall in Hell's Kitchen history, Keisha being frustrated, and of course only getting a black jacket in the first place due to Gabriel's all-time bad service. But despite all the inconsistency and lucky breaks, let's not forget about all the good he did this season, such as taking risk after risk and never backing down despite the failures, helping out teammates who seem to hate him for no reason, and of course, putting on insane leadership performances throughout the season, and to this day, holding the crown as the best leader in Hell's Kitchen history. I will say, edit-wise, it was pretty lackluster, but that's the thing. The editors didn't really need to give Scott much of a story, as the story told itself on screen. He truly is the comeback chef, and his resilience that led him to this insane win is one of the main things that makes this season so incredible. What an amazing run for Scott Cummings. So there you have it, guys, the story of Scott Cummings. Let me know where Scott ranks as a winner for you down below, and be sure to hit that subscribe and like button to support the channel, and I'll get you more story videos and HK content just like this. With all that said, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Get out of there.